All right. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming to this sort of interesting presentation that we're going to be giving today. Got a little bit of everything, a little bit of explanation, a little bit of performance, and then very excitingly, I'd like to invite you all to join us for a discussion at the very end to sort of talk about what you've seen and love to hear your ideas as well. I'm so fortunate today to be joined by, from Indiana University's Informatics Department, Professor Chris Raphael, right here. And my sister, Caitlin, who's a PhD student studying under Professor Raphael, also at Indiana. Both of them, yeah. In addition to their technological skills and expertise, both are also very well-accomplished oboists, which is very exciting. And I'm also so happy to have Professor David Schifrin from our own Yale School of Music here to be sharing some of his comments. And later on, we will also have a special appearance from Professor Frank Morelli, which is also very exciting. Yes. So, as just a broad overview of what you're going to hear today, we're going to be talking about multimedia performance, what it's been traditionally, what we are doing with it, sort of the changes and innovations we're making in this sphere, and as well as ideas for how multimedia performance can continue to grow in the future. This is our ending discussion, which I hope you guys will be able to take part in. But to look at what we're doing now, right, we need to look at what happened in the past and what has been done for the 20th and 21st centuries. So the traditional idea of a multimedia performance is this fixed media idea. So a very famous example is Musique Concrète, where, forgetting sort of the technical things that make it Musique Concrète, basically you have a fixed audio that plays oftentimes with a live acoustic ensemble. And there needs to be some sort of way of coordinating the acoustic players with the tape music. And either there's a conductor or the musicians will just know the tape well enough to be able to fit in. But the tape doesn't move and the musicians move around it. Similarly, for visual media, silent film is a very famous early example where you would have live soundtrack performers, so sometimes just a single pianist or organist or even a full orchestra. And the way they would stay in time with the film, which again doesn't move, or it can't change to the performer. Those musicians would have cue sheets, so they would know, oh, there's this event happening in the music that needs to coordinate with a certain scene in the film. A more modern example, of course, would be sort of this movies at the symphony idea. So if New York Philharmonic presents Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, they will have either a click track, the musician's ear, with a conductor as well, so they don't run away from the film. A slightly more modern example, and a little bit more flexible, is the use of Bluetooth cues in multimedia music. So basically what happens is you can have several different tracks of multimedia, usually audiovisual, that you align with your performance. And to move between those, you can activate usually a Bluetooth pedal that will change between these different sections. So you have some control over the timing of this, but ultimately what happens within, between each cue will stay the same. So the idea, of course, that I'm getting at with all these examples is that the media is immobile and the musician must accommodate around it. Now, I don't know about you, the rest of the musicians sorry, I've lost my mouse. Oh God, okay, sorry. Yeah, so for the performers in the audience, I personally don't like playing with something that is fixed. Of course, I think we love to have freedom when we're performing to make spontaneous decisions. And, we'll do the metronome work in the practice room. But I think a lot of the fun of performance, especially classical performance, is really being able to push the piece and see how far it can go. And this is going to lead to inconsistency between performances. But then if you have to conform to a fixed partner, having this expectation, that can then feel very limiting. So one of the ways that we're trying to work around this feeling of limitation with a fixed track is by incorporating a live score follower. In this case, we're using cadenza, also known as the Informatics Philharmonic. And I would like to invite Professor Chris Raphael up to talk about the genesis and give us a little background about this program.
Can I use the mic?
Yeah.
First, before I say anything, I want to add to the thanks. Special thanks to Caitlin, who put this whole connection between the four of us together, did a major part of the technical heavy lifting, and also is part of the creative vision behind this. So thanks very much to her, and also thanks to Nikki, who I'm meeting in person for the first time today, for the beautiful artwork and for reaching out to Joan Tower and making that connection, and also for being part of the creative vision. And also thanks to David Schifrin. It may seem like we sort of come from left field here. I'm in the School of Informatics, computer science. We are from a long way off. So I appreciate the openness to our way of doing things, which is a little bit different. When we have a performance that fails, well, we think of it more as an experiment rather than a performance, and we try to get the next one to be a little bit better. It might be. So I appreciate the openness to our way of doing things, which is a little bit different. We try very much to fit within the framework of musicians. I think it can't all be one side coming to the other. There has to be a little give and take on both parts. So a little bit about the history of this. I grew up playing in the orchestra. That was my first love. And I saw many iterations of the same experience of having a concerto soloist. Maybe it's a violin or a singer or a piano. And the first order approximation of the way things are supposed to work with the soloist is the orchestra follows the soloist. It may be a little bit more complicated than that, but it's a good way to think about it for starters. And so, not just the player's instrument, but the whole orchestra becomes sort of this extension of the thinking and the interpretation of the live player. It's a lot of power to put in somebody's hands, usually for good, maybe not always. I think that, from sort of a psychological point of view, the end result, I'm thinking about it from the player's perspective, is a really wonderful experience. It's aesthetically meaningful. It is instructive like one wouldn't believe. It's fun. It's just good from a lot of different angles. But the sad part of it is the demographics of the situation. In maybe a fair world, say there are 50 people in the orchestra and you're in the orchestra, maybe 1 out of 50 times that would be you. But of course it doesn't work that way. Maybe you play the contrabassoon and you're thinking there are no contrabassoon concertos, but it's not true. There are. But you still don't get to do it your fair share of the time, or maybe you are the third desk violinist or something like that. Quite deserving, talented in your own right, but according to the hierarchy of the ensemble, that's probably not going to be you. And when all is said and done, this is an experience that most people get infrequently, not nearly as much as they probably deserve. And so I'm also a scientist, and I'm a computer scientist, and it makes me think it's time to bring this aspect to bear on the problem. What if we had a computer that knew the score of the piece that we're trying to play? And what if it could follow you as you play and track your performance through the score? And maybe even better, what if it could just sort of predict how the future was going to evolve, which is, of course, something that you need to do if you're going to generate an accompaniment or another part that follows. Maybe it could even learn through rehearsals like people learn. So this was the idea to of course there are a couple decades after that initial conception of what might happen to get to the point where we are now, but we have built these tools, and we're at a point now, maybe the original conception was it was about concerto performances and raving critics and loud applause and things like that. And I think it's moved considerably further away from that. I don't really have too much time to go into that. But I would say we're at a point where we're trying to rework, reimagine, I know that word's so overused, to rethink the different ways that we might be able to bring this technology to bear in musical contexts. So I don't think I say too much more about it than that now, because that's what the whole evening is about, and I'm so glad that you're here to witness it. The one thing I just reiterate my comment on experiments. We've made a ton of progress, but the musical bar is super high. It's hard to understand from a musician's point of view how hard it is to do such simple things. So I think of this as maybe it's like the forte piano. It's the first attempt. There will be future generations. We are doing our first generation of experiments. When we made a lot of progress, and we probably didn't get it all completely right, well, we're still duking it out. So there's more to come. So that's all.
All right, thank you for that description and your introduction. So now I'm going to go over just an overview of our talk and an overview of those new novel applications. So these applications are going to focus on two major aspects of cadenza/infofill that Chris touched upon earlier. So one is this prediction, or automatically anticipating someone's musical trajectory as they're playing live during a concert or during a rehearsal. And two is the ability to time stretch music. That is to play back music faster or slower so it can follow a live soloist, or to use it for other applications. All right, so specifically, the three areas that we researched are: one, live synchronization animation. So this is similar to what Nikki was talking about in the silent movie sphere, or the symphony at the movies. So in this case, instead of the orchestra being very constrained to follow a video, we're going to flip that on its head. So instead of that, the video is going to be following Nikki as she freely changes her interpretation over time. And Nikki's going to talk a bit more about the artistic merit of such a setup. Second, I'm going to talk about a project we did with Yale alumni, faculty, and students on virtual ensemble assembly. So these are remote recordings created, but in a way that doesn't make people use a click track. So a click track can be very constricting, as Nikki also discussed earlier. You can't pick your own tempo, you can't do rubato. Generally, there's a lot of decisions that you may want to make it without the click track, but you're being constricted by having that framing. So we were looking at, okay, how do we do this but allow people to have that freedom? So assembly becomes a little bit more of a challenge, so we're going to talk about the strategies we use in order to make that a reality. All right, last, we're going to do a performance of chamber music, but with one part that is pre-recorded by Nikki in the past. So this is similar to the concerto application that Chris was describing, but now instead of a concerto accompanying, it's just one single bass clarinet part recorded by Nikki. And we're going to talk a little bit at the end, or I hope you'll discuss with us some of the ramifications of that setup. So having a trio instead of an accompanist setup. All right.
Okay. So starting with the live synchronized animation, the example that we are looking at today is Joan Tower's Wings. Some of you may have seen a very early prototype last May at my degree recital, and now this is in its full form currently. So I think one of the big questions is, why add animation at all? Can't music just stand on its own sort of auditory merit? So for me, this is a big question. As many of you may know, I've been spending almost the past 2.5 years creating many animated performances, mostly on YouTube. And why would I do this instead of just regular performance? Well, one reason, it's fun, I like it. But there is a deeper artistic reason for me, and that is really the problem of classical music's relatability to general audiences. And for me, this is both an imagined problem and a personal one. Even though I've been studying classical music for about 20 years now, if I encounter a piece by a composer I don't know, using a musical idiom that I'm not familiar with, it can be very hard to connect on that first listen, no matter how amazing the performance is, just because I don't have the tools and the skills to understand what's going on. And if I feel that way, how must a general public with absolutely no classical music training feel about even the most average classical Brahms performance, for example? So the way I approach bridging this gap is through image and movement. I think image and movement are really much more immediately understandable and accessible to most audiences, much more so than classical music. And by reinforcing what's happening in the music through visual cues, I believe you can more effectively tell the story of the piece, especially to these novice audiences. Now, this is all well and good when it comes to YouTube videos, where you can just precisely do what you want in the video editor, but becomes a problem in live performances. One of the key components to making these animated performances work is a very careful synchronization between what you see and what you hear. For example, if you have a very loud, fast passage, you'd want to complement that with something that looks loud and fast. So you could use bright, flashing colors and very quick movement. But if that very loud-looking animation plays during a section of music that's very still and very delicate, it's going to be confusing, it's not going to work, it's going to be distracting, and it will detract from the overall quality of the performance, which is absolutely not what we would like to convey. So as I said before, this type of synchronization is very easy in post-production, but you definitely can't achieve that with just a cue sheet, and even with a click track. That type of synchronization is still difficult to have a precise lineup. And this is especially the case the smaller your movements get. So, for example, in Wings, you are going to see sections of flashing dots, and each dot will align with a pretty quick sextuplet. And within these sextuplets, I will have a little bit of rubato, some will speed up, some will slow down as I see fit. As a quick aside about these flashing dots that you're going to see, they do come up quite a few times, and they're actually another program created by Caitlin. So each dot represents a note, and each note is connected by a line. So this line actually represents the interval between those two notes that the dot represents. And the thicker the line, the more frequently that interval comes up. The thinner the line, it only comes up a few times. So back to why animation. Having something that can follow you and line these up without the performer having to worry while also contending with a very difficult piece of music is really essential to pulling off a performance like this in a live setting. And then lastly, I just want to touch on why Wings in particular works well for a medium of performance such as this. So one is that as a piece of solo clarinet work, performances can be highly variable when it comes to timing. As other clarinetists in the room and potentially saxophonists may know, this piece is an absolute stamina killer. You want to have the ability to sort of be flexible with how much time you take on certain passages, depending on your condition that day. So having that flexibility, not being tied down to a fixed piece of media, is really important. Another section, or another part about this piece is that it's very well known, I think, within the clarinet community and saxophone as well, but much less so to the broader classical music, and I would say not at all to the general audience. But this is an amazing piece. You know, there's this quasi-programmatic title that is then, in a way, elaborated on in very vivid gestural motions that, in my mind, paints a very clear picture. And by bringing that out in a visual animation, I think it's a way for, hopefully, me to share what I see and what I experience with Wings with a much broader audience. So with that said, I hope I've convinced you. And now I'll let Caitlin explain how all of this works.
All right. So the first aspect I want to talk about in the technology that can allow this very tight video synchronization is the ability to anticipate, is it close enough? All right, anticipate a musician's trajectory in real time. So this concept of anticipation is a familiar one to most musicians. When you're in orchestra, you need to anticipate when the conductor is going to place their downbeat in order to stay with them and stay with the rest of the group. In an accompaniment scenario, either as a pianist or you're just playing an accompanimental role in chamber music, you need to anticipate the soloist's next note position in order to stay in time. And there is that old adage, if you don't anticipate, you're going to be late. So this is a concept that musicians are familiar with, but how do we translate that to language that a computer will understand? Like, we feel anticipation, but what does that really mean in terms of very concrete terms? So what we did was we defined anticipation time as the amount of time from now until the next note should be played. This may seem a little bit foreign at first, but we do it instinctually. For example, if you have, I don't know, a measure rest until you have to come in, you need to decide, when do I pick up my instrument? When do I prepare to play? So we're doing all of that unconsciously, but inherent in that is a guess in when that note is going to happen. So, okay, in order to better understand how the computer makes that guess, I'm going to ask Nikki to do a little bit of a demo for us, and we're all going to participate along in the demo. So here on the screen, you see a bit of a score. It's a scale, and what I want is for us to clap when Nikki reaches the top of the scale. I could show it, or we could just do it together.
Let's all try it.
Yeah, let's just do it for the first time. Okay. Amazing. Y'all did great. Unsurprising for this crowd. But so think about what was going on in your mind when you decided to make that clap. I'm guessing Nikki's going at a pretty slow tempo, and based on that tempo, you were able to extrapolate, now's when I should clap. All right, Nikki, why don't we do it again? This time I won't help you. Oh, you were surprised then, right? So I'm guessing initially you were expecting Nikki to continue with the same tempo, pretty similar to the first time, which would mean you would clap a lot later. But then Nikki speeds up, which means, oh no, I gotta change that internal conception of when to clap to a time that's earlier than now. That's why, okay, maybe y'all were a little bit late, but you weren't that late. So this type of changing mind over time is what a program like Cadenza and InfoFill does in order to track a musician's trajectory and predict those future notes. So as it hears more notes being played, that prediction of how long do I wait is being refined based on what the soloist is doing. So Chris mentioned another aspect of this, which is training. So I'm gonna do another exercise to demonstrate this. Nikki's gonna do this again, but I'm gonna tell you, Nikki is gonna play the same way that she played previously. So she's gonna use the same interpretation that she just did. All right, y'all got it this time. So just like you guys were able to internalize that Nikki's gonna start slow then speed up, now InfoFill, after hearing it twice, is going to be able to remember the previous interpretation and then use that to inform its prediction. So as you guys can see, you guys were a lot more accurate the second time. And having that foreknowledge has the potential to increase the accuracy of the predictions. All right. So great, anticipation, all well and good, but what does that have to do with video synchronization? So before getting really in depth, I want to talk a little bit about what animation is at its very core. So you can see on the screen a series of moving images. They look just like kind of a slideshow that's going at a pretty constant rate. But if you speed these images up a little bit, it becomes smooth. Our eye perceives the movement as something that is continuous. The nice thing about animation as just a series of frames played at varying rates is that the rate is the deciding factor for how fast we perceive the motion to happen. For example, what we see now is about 15 frames per second, but we could increase that frame rate to something like 55 frames per second. So now the movement is a lot quicker. So we have the ability to anticipate when the musician will place their next note and the ability to control how fast animation is going to be played. So those two things can be put together in order to create synchronous real-time video. So here's essentially how it works. If a player speeds up, the software is going to anticipate the next note to happen sooner, just like you guys were able to anticipate that based on Nikki speeding up. So because of that, the animation frame rate is going to increase. The movement is going to be faster. Conversely, if Nikki slows down, the software is going to anticipate the next note to happen later, and the frame rate is going to slow down. All right, at this point, Nikki is going to perform Wings for you guys. While she is setting up, I can take a few questions if you guys have any questions or comments at this point. Set up, yep. That's, oh, question.
Yeah, is this considered a type of machine learning?
Yeah, it would be considered a type of machine learning, especially the training aspect, where you're learning from previous patterns in order to improve the current setup. Chris can expand on that if...
Machine learning is?
Oh, sure. I will explain what machine learning is. So machine learning is when you use a computer program to learn patterns from data. So in this case, we have, especially in the training part, I think the definition, Chris is better with the definition of machine learning, but especially in the training part, it's taking data from your first take and using it to inform the predictions of data from the second take. Any other questions? Thank you for your question, by the way. Oh.
Have you had much interaction with the film industry?
We have not. That's definitely people I want to talk to, because I think this type of technology would be really cool for them. I know directors sometimes have very clear ideas of when exactly they want shots to happen, We've encountered similar sentiments when talking to more fixed media composers where they say, okay, I designed this piece to have these different times, then why is it stretching? So filmmakers may have a similar outlook, but I'm still definitely very interested in talking to them and seeing their take on this type of technology. Thanks for your question. Are you ready, Nikki?
Yes.
Amazing. All right, I will turn the recognition on. Wow, Nikki, thank you for that fabulous performance. This is the first time I've seen Nikki perform this in front of an audience, and she sounded amazing, and also her animation looked just so amazing. And
Oh, praise me more. I love validation.
I guess before we continue, I have one more technical note as well. You guys can notice that the actions usually were aligned exactly with Nikki, but sometimes it was a bit early and sometimes it was a bit late. So that's because it is a prediction. The computer is making a guess of where Nikki is gonna play next, and it's usually right, but it's not gonna be right 100% of the time. All right.
Does the computer have the score?
It does, yes. So it's using the score in order to make this prediction. So in the example we saw, you were able to know where to clap because you saw the score and there was that label saying clap. So Cadenza is working the same way, where it knows the score and it's using that in order to do this tracking and in order to figure out when it is the best to place those notes. Very similar to as if we're like listening to a concert and we're looking at a score following it along.
I wasn't sure if it was reacting very, very quickly or actually following a map.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, actually. So without this type of predictive technology, we can't actually get something like video control, because you need to interpolate into the future to know, okay, how fast do I move these frames in order to meet her at the next note? So for this type of technology, you actually need that prediction. There's other types of score following based quote unquote technology that is more reactive. So those are two different classes of technology.
If we play this again now.
I think I would pass out.
Would the video have been trained to have a faster reaction time, so it would be more with her than?
So you actually decide explicitly after each run whether you want to train or not. So in this case, Nikki clicked no to training, so it wouldn't have trained. But if she had clicked yes, then it would have learned her pattern. For something like Wings, that may not.
That puts the performer into a box too, because you have to, in order to play with the trained computer, you have to train yourself to play it the same way.
Yeah, so I
Yeah.
will say for Wings, there is some training in it. I did most of my training actually over the summer to really get it locked in. But the problem is sometimes you train it too much, and if I'm, really crapping out at the end and I need a lot of time, I don't want it to rush me. So yeah, for a piece like this, actually, it's better to keep the training a bit more minimal. Great. Yes, Stephanie.
You never do this, but what if you played a measure twice in a row by accident? Would all get off a measure, or?
Sometimes it'll catch it if it's a small enough mistake, and sometimes it'll crash and burn horrifically. It sort of depends on the scale of how bad was the mistake, and how far off is it thrown. Because if you keep going, sometimes it'll catch it. It's like a real person if you're in a rehearsal. If you can recognize where another person is, you can get back on. But if you just have no idea what's happening, you're just gonna sit back and wait for it to grind to a halt. All right.
Another
Shall
question.
we- Another question, sorry.
I like what you said about anticipation before. So when you, I don't know if you've experienced this, but if you play it on a different machine or different system, does it know its own latency? Or do you have to sort of factor that in as it, who learns that first? How do you fine tune that?
So in this setup specifically, if you notice, I guess you can't see it because everything's happening on this computer, but we have both the animation control and the score following happening on the same machine. So what that means is, I think I measured the latency at one point, but it's not more than 10 milliseconds. So that's something that we don't need to worry about whatsoever. If we did do it on different machines, then we would need to do some tests to measure, okay, we sent the signal now, how much time until it receives that signal? Good. Questions? We'll move on. Nice. All right. Okay, so next I'm going to talk about a project that we did with Yale faculty, students, and now alumni, which is Virtual Ensemble Assembly. So as I said before, this project is about creating remote performances where players don't need to use a click track. And as I touched upon earlier as well, there's a lot of reasons why we don't like click tracks. It's constricting you in, you can't do exactly what you want. So we were saying, okay, without a click track, can we still assemble these pieces? And the answer, as we're showing you, is yes, but the way we do it is basically stretching these parts so they fit each other. But there's some complexity to that. So before I go more into our project with Yale, I want to quickly touch upon 2 previous assemblies that we did and what makes this project with Yale a little bit different. We previously worked with a clarinet trio at the Jacob School and an octet at the University der Kunst in Berlin. And in those 2 instances, the players either knew each other or were very familiar with the piece. Especially for the Jacobs group, they were rehearsing Brahms' Clarinet Trio before the pandemic, so they knew how each other played, they knew how the interpretation should go, they knew their vision as a group, essentially. What we're doing for Yale is very different. So in this case, everyone played the piece without any preconceived notion of how it should go. So everyone picked their own tempos, everyone picked their own interpretations. Someone might do some rubato somewhere, other people might do it otherwhere. We didn't align note lengths or anything like that. So specifically what we did, we reached out to David Schifrin, who helped put us in touch with a lot of amazing people at Yale. And we ended up picking the Mozart Serenade in E-flat Adagio movement. And our group is listed here, Mr. Schifrin and Nikki for clarinet, Mr. Purvis and Olivia Martinez on horn, Mr. Morelli and Elena Katz on bassoon, and Chris and I on oboe. So we never played together before. I've only met a lot of you guys in person today. So what we did was we didn't know each other. We had no preconception of the piece. So when I got the recordings in, everyone had very, very different interpretations. Some people took the adagio pretty fast. Some people took it a lot slower. Some people wanted a very smooth articulation, long note lengths. Other people were more bouncy. So to give you guys an idea of how this sounds without any processing, I'm going to play you guys a take of just taking all the recordings that I got raw, stacking them on top of each other as if there were a click track, quote unquote, and seeing what we got. Enough of that. So initially it might be promising, a little out of tune, but this might work. And then very quickly, everyone pulls apart. So something that we're not going to explicitly talk about in this talk is tuning correction. And that's actually relatively straightforward. We just assume everyone should be at A440 and adjust accordingly. But what I'm going to focus on here is the timing correction aspects. So what you heard was kind of a mess in terms of synchronization. Nobody was together. So how do we change that? And the answer is audio stretching. So earlier I showed you how video can be stretched to make us perceive animation go faster versus slower. And with audio, you could do something very similar. It's a little bit more complicated because if you don't do this in a careful way, the pitch is also going to change. So we want the pitch to stay steady, but this is doable. Just take my word for it, it's doable. So specifically, how we processed each part was like this. So we would first take the score of each instrument, and in this case, the clarinet one part, first 2 measures. Oh, we're not showing the slides, oh no. Oh. Good thing hi, Mr. Morelli. We'll talk to you later.
He's a special guest for later. Yes, he'll come back.
All right, where was I? All right, so We first have the clarinet score, we have the recording timestamp, and what we want to do first is find the timestamp associated with every note in the clarinet 1 part. So in this example, let's say the first note starts at timestamp 1 second. The second note starts 2.5 seconds after the start of the recording, and so on and so forth. We'll go through and label everything. And then we repeat that process with every other instrument. So we got clarinet 2 recording, imaginary clarinet recording starts at near the beginning. The second note starts about 0.5 seconds afterward, and then so on and so forth. We do this labeling. So if we just stack these two hypothetical parts on top of each other, it's going to sound a lot like what you guys just heard. So it looks like here none of the notes are lining up. Especially egregious is the fact that clarinet 2 is supposed to start after clarinet 1, and in this version it's starting quite a bit before. So one way you can approach alignment is, I'm not saying this is a good way, but one way you could approach alignment is making everything line up with clarinet 1. So here I'm highlighting the clarinet 1 note onsets times, and all we got to do is move each of the clarinet 2 notes to a good spot and stretch their length according to conform with the part from clarinet 1. So as you may have guessed from the arbitrary nature of this, there's an infinite number of ways to put together this assembly in such a way that clarinet 2 and clarinet 1 are in sync. We could stretch the clarinet 1 part to fit clarinet 2, or we could do something really ridiculous like this. So if we look at the alignment, okay, looks like they're still lining up, but take a look at how the clarinet 2 part was stretched. These are supposed to be straight eighth notes. All these little pieces are supposed to be the same size, but you've got a huge range. Some of them are more than a second, some of them are more like an eighth of a second. So if you listen to this, it would sound just like every note is a different length, wobbling around like crazy. So now the question becomes, how do we create a good virtual assembly? Where a good virtual assembly is something that's tasteful, something that the musicians feel reflect themselves. And what we did for this Mozart Serenade experiment was find the final stretch configuration that compromises 3 goals. So first of all, because it's Mozart, we want the tempo to not wiggle around too much. We want it to be fairly steady. Second of all, obviously the parts need to be in sync. And third of all, we want the original parts tempo patterns to be preserved. So if someone does some kind of rubato, maybe takes a little retard somewhere, we want some of that to reflect itself in this final recording. A quick note on these goals is that they don't naturally go together. I noted that everyone recorded their part at a different tempo. So what tempo are we gonna pick? Naturally, just by picking one tempo, we have to change everybody else in order to conform to that. In addition, with the parts being together and retaining the original tempo patterns, if you care only about retaining people's original intent, it's not going to be in sync. It'll sound very similar to what you guys heard in the beginning. So we're going to have to stretch everyone a little bit in order to get that synchrony. And just a reminder from before we listen to this, I wanted to remind you that we didn't discuss any of this at an interpretational level before sending in our recordings. So what you're hearing isn't something rehearsed in the traditional way where people decide on an interpretation together. You wanna do no, no. Start at the beginning. All right. Before we go on, I'm remembering there's 2 points that I forgot to mention about the video. So first of all, you guys see that there are video as well as audio. So the speed of people's movement in the video reflects how much we had to stretch from the original. So I don't know if you remember, there's one part where I'm in uber slow motion, and that's because I didn't wait long enough for my rest. So we had to really stretch out that section. And another note is the mixing is not automatically done. So I'm sure you guys doing pandemic-related virtual performances have run into the problem of, okay, how do we mix this after the fact? So initially we were researching mixing, but we decided for this version to actually do it by hand. So those are all hand done and not machine learning or anything like that. All right, so now we want to have some comments from people who participated in this project.
Yeah, so first we're going to invite virtual Mr. Morelli to share his thoughts. Finally, he reappears.
Nikki and I just listened through the finished product again, and I'm looking forward. She said she will have for us at some point the actual takes from where we started, which I think would really make it even a more amazing accomplishment that she was able to produce. The coronavirus, the fact that we all had to go remote, created opportunities, challenges. For me personally, I had never gone I had never learned about that much about remote recording or even putting things together in my own basic way. I then started trying to learn to do things in GarageBand, the most basic of apps to use for this type of purpose. And so when the idea was presented to do this project that we're talking about today, I found it kind of astounding, knowing how much trouble I was going through in my own limited experience in lining things up, using remote recordings of students and then putting them together. So watching the process, being part of this process was really enlightening. The finished product, I think, speaks for itself. That's not where we started, and in a way, intentionally, we weren't supposed to start there. So I can't even imagine all the possible practical applications for this, but I really look forward to seeing what the future holds with this type of technology. I guess a downside, if you want to also look at what things how that technology works and how it affects us all, would be often when, in my experience, doing any sort of remote recordings and then putting them together, you might have perhaps a bass instrument, a bottom instrument who has first recorded his or her line, and then one builds upon that. And in that way, you get some of the satisfaction of playing with someone else. So I guess I do miss the in-the-moment collaboration that would come from having more than one person at a time. Now, I guess in the future, there's always the question of latency and all that, but the idea of being able to do some of this maybe synchronously, but at a distance, knowing then the parts that were difficult to get together, or knowing, okay, don't be too uptight, let's play together, we can fix things. I've had myself limited experience that way in, like, if you want to call it commercial recording, popular recording. You know, we spend our lives in doing acoustical recordings. You find a great room, you get a great engineer, everybody plays at the same time in that space. I've had limited experience sitting in my own little cubicle and 4 or 5 other people in their own little cubicles, and then later fixing everything up. And it made a giant difference to have that opportunity. And of course, then we were laying it down together instead of individually. So, I mean, it's hard for me to even imagine where this could go if one is thinking of a way of doing it so that there is some sort of rallying flag, you know, one thing already laid down or something. I mean, in the case of commercial music, you have a thing called the rhythm section. That's why they call it the rhythm section, right? And so everyone is sort of playing off of that as opposed to our classical approach of physical. We're obviously listening to our own kind of rhythm section, but it's not as regulated as, say, piano, bass, and drums in the case of, say, popular music or jazz type music.
Great. Thank you, virtual Mr. Morelli, for your comments. Now I'd like to invite Mr. Schifrin. Do you want to share your thoughts and experiences?
How's this? Whoa. Now turn it back off, please.
We've adjusted.
I don't think any of us quite knew what to make of this project before we did it. I said, well, what tempo are we going to play it at? What are we going to tune to? No, don't worry about it. Those were the instructions. Just play. And of course, we came to it with very different experience levels. I know Frank and Bill Purvis and I have played this piece, you know, many times with one another and with lots of other people, and have very specific ideas of how it goes. And I think I hear some of that in this performance. But ultimately, I think it's really important who does the mixing and editing and stretching. So Caitlin's stamp is all over this interpretation. And I think you did a marvelous job of bringing order to chaos. Really incredible. That being said, I think as Frank put right at the outset, the interest for this kind of thing and this technology was vastly heightened by the epidemic. And I think some of you in this room were Stephanie was in a group that we coached to play the Nielsen Woodwind Quintet. But it was very, very different. We had click tracks and tuning, and we would put together sections. And the last movement of Nielsen's Woodwind Quintet, for the uninitiated, is a theme and variations. So we had very finite blocks of music that we could do. And we only had to fix one thing at a time. And if one part wasn't quite working, that person could re-record. We didn't have that for this. You had to work with what you had, which was even more extraordinary. I would love to hear the first mix again, a little more of that. As Professor Raphael mentioned earlier, it was you in your email response to hearing this online when you sent out both to those of us who had played, that it was especially amusing to hear the end of it, where people finished and that's it. And I think that'd be interesting for the audience, for everybody to hear just how chaotic it became. And it was like the last half a minute of a marathon with people crossing the finish line. so I didn't mean to put you on the spot. We didn't rehearse this. Like walking down the practice room hallway with all the doors open. Not really recognizable as the same piece. Or maybe walking into a rehearsal where everybody's just warming up on different things, and that you were able to, make that conform to the score in a tempo was remarkable. It seems like you chose note lengths that had the most common denominators. You didn't choose my note lengths, in other words. But that's fine. You had to make it work, and
Yeah, it was a whole
and I was interested to hear it with the second clarinet part played in a way that's not exactly how I did it. That is just remarkable. And so just talking about the process, it's just extraordinary that you could do that. One of the things that occurred to me about this project and about the ways that Yale School of Music dealt with isolation of wind players that I thought would have been a remarkable test case for this technology was that in the basement of Sprague Hall across the street, our amazing recording tech folks put together a series of essentially 9 rooms, eight practice rooms and a studio down in Jack V's domain, and allowed wind players who were not allowed to congregate during the height of the pandemic to play chamber music together and to have orchestra sectionals with as many as 8 players and a conductor in the studio. And I started thinking that would be a fantastic way to record chamber music and just fix the broken parts. But I was dismayed to learn the wired together rooms. And the beauty of the wired together rooms was that we could record, not just record, but rehearse with no latency because they were wired, or with such minimal latency that it was not noticeable to performers. Whereas there's no program that I'm aware of where you can do that on the internet yet. But it occurred to me that having a setup with multiple rooms, much the way pop and country music has been recorded for decades and decades, where people are in isolation chambers with headphones on, but performing together, or in cells, like the rhythm section could record something and then somebody else can record it another time, sort of the way Frank was describing. And this was something just I never thought would fly. And to be perfectly honest and candid, I'd far prefer to get the 8 of us in a room and actually have a rehearsal and then record it. But it does open the door to wondering about what the most practical uses might be. I mentioned film scoring earlier because I've done a lot of that earlier in my life, and the two ways to synchronize music with the picture: a streamer, a line that goes from left to right, and then a conductor has to adjust the tempo and make sure that the upbeat lines with the streamer, so the downbeat is on the next scene so that the cue will line up, or just mathematically devise a click track so that the score, which doesn't allow, it allows for beginning and end, but it doesn't allow for a lot of flexibility and nuance within the scene, unless the composer rewrites the music and makes a retard here and speeds up another place. But it occurred to me that if the music were just recorded approximately the length of the scene, that this technology would make, well, it would save the studios a lot of money, I think, because they could synchronize the music with a lot fewer takes. So don't tell the musicians union that I suggested this. When Frank Morelli and I first virtually met Chris Raphael, we recorded for the Cadenza app the last movement of the third of Beethoven's duos for bassoon and clarinet, which is also a theme in variations, which we chose for that reason, so we could do it in sections. And we were going back and forth with metronome markings and playing with metronome on headphones so that we both played the same tempo. And this bar will take some time, so let's put an extra beat in here and there. And then a lot of people were doing a lot of that kind of thing. But I think it was Chris who said, well, don't worry about that so much. Because you knew, I guess, that you could apply some of this magic and make it look like Frank and I. But we actually did rehearse a lot virtually. And I'm going to end my talk by asking you what you talked about this more in the future, and I think I'd really like to hear what the future of this application and other applications to your technology might be. So thank you. I'm going to.
So should I do it now?
Oh, I don't know. Did you have an agenda for this?
Well, I have an answer, but I don't want to disrupt the flow. Is the thing. So I'm happy to respond, and it can wait.
Yeah, maybe we can wait until later, just because I know some people have to leave. So maybe we can do the block first, and then in the discussion section. We
Maybe
can
you have questions for me as a live participant in that experiment.
Yes, please, everybody, questions open to anybody's experience. I think there's the four of us were here who participated, so any questions about our experience would be great at this point.
Yes, Tony.
I once watched a interview with Pavarotti, and he said he doesn't treat singing in opera as a job. He treats it as enjoyment. So collaboration among the musicians is definitely some, a big part of that is actually the enjoyment. Like we came to the same similar conclusion of when to land on the downbeat of this measure, and right after that we feel, oh my God, I just met my soulmate or something like that. So I think the collaboration is a big part of the fun, the source of the motivation of doing the chamber music. But with your technology, I feel like this thing is kind of missing. So, is there any response to this question? Or do you have
a dazzling achievement, though. But the most dazzling technology, I hope, is not going to ever replace musicians coming together in the same place and making music together. Well, I'll tell one other story from my experiences. Many, many years ago in the 1970s, I participated as a clarinetist in the Cleveland Orchestra with Michael Tilson Thomas conducting Carmina Burana. And we performed it in Cleveland with two completely different soloists that were ultimately on the Columbia Records release of that piece. And after the performance, the soprano and the tenor were dismissed, and we went into an auditorium where all the seats were taken up. We took up the whole auditorium for orchestra and chorus, just spread out all. We couldn't really hear each other, but we watched MTT. And they put the tuba player in a box with headphones and no soloists. And this must have been 1973, 74, 5. It was before you were doing this kind of work. But we just recorded all passages that had the solo voices with no voices, and Judy Blagan, the soprano, and I forgot who the tenor was, dubbed it in New York. And I said something to a guy named Andy Kasdan, who was the producer, and said, well, but is this representative for what we do? And he said, no, this is a different art form. And okay. And it won a Grammy. So it is, just to your point, that it's not the same, but it's pretty impressive. It's different.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think for me personally as a performer as well, I think we're held to a different standard in recordings as opposed to live. Like, if I can be self-critical for a second. In the Wings performance that you just heard, I'm pretty happy with it as I'm playing it for you guys. I would feel very hesitant to put that online or to release that because of certain imperfections that I know I would just listen to over and over again and think people who are listening to this recording are just narrowing in on that. And so the nice thing with a solo piece, right, you can just snip parts in and out, and you put those in, and it's fine. You get a perfect take. With the ensemble, I actually tried to do this with my Messiaen Quartet for the End of Time chamber group last semester when we recorded. It's a lot more difficult, especially when you're recording together. It's actually in this very room. We recorded together. There are issues with spatialization and all of these things where we were able to do some edits and sort of get that real perfect recording take. But it was a lot more difficult. And I think if you want, it's not satisfying in the moment. Absolutely not. I agree with you, Tony. But to be able to get that level of perfection. Oh, sorry, Mr. Schiffrin, what were you going to say?
No, but it's to that point that I was lamenting the disappearance of the wired together studios, because you could play the Messiaen Quartet all together and see one another on the giant video monitors and adjust the balance. And if you had a really good take, but the violin was out of tune, or clarinet squeaked or whatever, you could just redo that part and make it fit. But you'd still have had the experience of simultaneously recreating.
Yeah, exactly.
both those pieces of music.
Exactly, and I think the nice thing about this technology is that those edits up until now have to be done manually. And if you can sort of optimize this type of program, it's just the click of the button. You put in your parameters and everything just fits. So, yeah.
When Caitlin was explaining the process, I started trying to count up the hours that it took you to do that. Did you keep a log? It was quite labor intensive, I think.
So what I actually did, I think I didn't do a great job explaining this earlier, but is there a mouse? Oh, there is a mouse, amazing. So these 3 parameters here were literally the only 3 values I had to tweak. So we built an algorithm basically that would say, okay, I'm going to find the best combination, and there's 3 basically knobs that I can tweak. One is how steady is the tempo, one is how together are the parts, and one is how much is the original patterns preserved. So all I had to do is find, okay, what are the best 3 sets of numbers that represent how much I care about the 3 of them. So it was work to build the machine that made this, but the actual assembly process wasn't that tricky.
Oh. Would this machine work for other pieces?
It would, yeah. So the way
you build the machine and then you have it.
Yeah. So we could. It would be very easy to take another machine and then, take another piece and then assemble it in the same way. For this one, it is more optimized toward classical style music because it does have that steady tempo aspect. So for some other types of music, maybe that's not something you care about so much. So in the Brahms example that we described earlier, what we did was more like, where is it? This example here. So in the Brahms clarinet trio, basically we picked a leading part, and then at all points in the score, we would say, everyone else follows this leader. So we didn't control any of the steady tempo. We didn't control any of that. We just assumed, okay, these people know what they're doing. We'll pick a leader, and then we'll make everyone else, quote unquote, follow the leader. And that ended up sounding pretty good, partially because they knew the piece they played together before, and partially because romantic music can handle a little bit of tempo wiggle, whereas when we tried the same strategy with the Mozart, it just got faster and slower and faster and slower, and it sounded really bad.
It is a different art form.
Yes, Marty.
Yeah, I guess I'm just wondering, when you say stretching, I'm curious, like, is that only increasing the duration? Because then I guess I just wonder, like, if somebody plays a note too long or something, how do you make that shorter? Like, do you have to go for the lowest common, or like the longest common length denominator? Because that definitely didn't sound like you had been like, oh, well, we're just gonna take the slowest tempo that everybody had.
What we did was actually very similar. Let me go back to the video example. So specifically, what we did was we took audio and cut it into a bunch of little overlapping chunks. So then it functions very similar to frames in an animation. So that way we could say, okay, we want this to be longer. We'll repeat some frames to make it longer. We want it to be shorter. We'll skip every so odd frame to make it shorter. So that gives a lot more flexibility.
I see.
So it happens on a note-by-note basis. Each note could be stretched by a different amount, and in general would be.
Or shrunk.
Or shrunk, yeah.
Oh.
And I just have one more comment in that, like, in terms of like technology or like this sort of technology and separate art form than live music making, I think that has really interesting applications because then you can play with the sounds that you have that you have like extemporized from live performance. And Nikki and I are doing a group project in one of our classes that I think will involve some of that playing around with pre-recorded work, and then us playing live on top of that. So.
Marty, that's a fantastic segue to our final example.
No, go back.
Spoilers,
Go back.
Sorry. So yes, as Marty so helpfully led us into, our last example is combining live performance with pre-recorded audio. And in this case, we are doing the 3-part Ruchakar from JS Bach's musical offering. So the reason we did this is a test subject, or a lab rat, if you will, for the Yale Clarinet Celebration this Sunday at 3 p.m. in Sprague, if you guys are available. So the piece that we would be using this for would be the clarinet arrangement premiere for Joan Towers' fanfare for the Uncommon Woman number 5, which she very graciously asked us to premiere with a live animation very similar to Wings. Now, while very exciting, there is a little bit of trepidation going into this project because unlike sort of the vanilla cadenza in Faux-Fill, which only handles one voice functionally at a time, this would now be following a quartet, so 4 different voices. While generally moving in unison, we were a little unsure that everything would be able to be detected. So we wanted to test it out, and we decided to use this fugue, the 3-part Richicar, and have the top 2 fugal voices set for live clarinet and oboe, and then a digital bass clarinet. So this bass clarinet was made through a recording that I did over the summer, input into cadenza, and then that recording follows us afterwards. And we have very affectionately nicknamed this hybrid of me and the computer, Nikki-tron. Here we go. So I'll let Kaylin explain how exactly, yeah, exactly. I'll let Kaylin explain the inner workings of Nikki-tron.
All right, so I'm not going to go into way too much depth here, but Nikki-tron uses those anticipation and time stretching concepts I explained earlier in order to stay in sync with us in real time. So in terms of anticipation, Nikki-tron is anticipating when real Nikki and I are going to place our next notes in real time. So it's doing something very similar to that clapping exercise where it's guessing at every point, okay, where are they going to play next? Where are they going to play next? So using that knowledge, it's then able to time stretch individual notes in order to match us at our next note onset. So instead of stretching in a non-real-time way, like we saw in Mozart, everyone recorded beforehand, we stretched it individually, can do it at my leisure. This is happening in real time. So as it's guessing where we're going to play next, it's going to stretch Nikki's part in order to stay in line with us. All right, so we're going to start preparing and play this, and as we play, we want you to keep something in mind. So how is this similar or different from a quote-unquote real trio where there are 3 live players? So here, me and Nikki have agency. We are driving the piece forward, but bass clarinet Nikki-tron is following us. It doesn't really have a mind of its own, quote-unquote. All right. Oh, that's our cat. That's that's our cat.
Confusingly, she was named Mickey, like Mickey Mouse. So in the house, it was always a little, who are you asking for, Mickey or the cat? Yeah, exactly.
So we will set up and then play it, and then we welcome your comments. Yeah, that's true. We're all performing together, you know. Nikki-tron deserves some recognition here. All right, amazing.
Nice. That's a real trio. have to see us warm up. Sorry.
Could I get an A, Nikki? Real Nikki?
That's dangerous.
Close enough. Okay,
Yeah.
but let's do it. Let's do it.
tuned to a fixed pitch?
Oh, no. No, Nikki Tron is whatever Nikki's pitch was when she recorded the bass clarinet part.
So we'll do some real chamber music and tune to Nikki Tron and tune to the bass players.
So you're going to respond to Nikki-tron too?
Oh yeah, Nikki Tron's a full member. All right, ready?
Yeah, let's do Should we worry about that?
Let's see what happens.
All right, yeah, let's see what happens. Let's see what happens. Oh, do you want to sit on?
No, can you just?
Oh, okay.
coming today. I know if anyone needs to leave, feel free. We'll hang around as long as people want to discuss until we get kicked out of the room. But yeah, thank you again, and let's hear the thoughts. So what do you guys think of Nikitron, first of all? Oh, no, yes, go first.
I absolutely love it. I remember back to 2017, I went to a dance concert. So they were collaborating with Microsoft. They were using the HoloLens. I believe that was the name of that. And I just thought maybe you could, I'm no tech, technology guy. Like I don't know anything about that. But I'm thinking maybe you could create a hollow version of Nikitron. HoloLens, so you can actually see Nikitron interact with the real Nikitron.
That'd be pretty cool. That'd be pretty cool.
Great, yeah. Lloyd, yeah.
So, I'm sorry this question was already asked, I had to duck out really quickly. So, the technology is tracing your sound, correct? So, what, specifically in the sound is it tracing? Is it tracing pitch, the rhythm? But I guess where I'm going with this question is when I was observing Wings, there were these strange moments in the animation where, Nikki would reach this juncture in the music where you had to breathe. And then what would happen after you took a breath was always, well not always, but occasionally it wouldn't quite line up visually like the music. So to tie this back to my initial thought, is there scope for the technology to sense and react to your breathing? Because if the goal is ultimately for it to be like another musician or another human being, then as someone who's a chamber musician, reacting to those extra musical impulses is something that's important. So initially, I guess it's a three-pronged question. What exactly does it react to, and is there scope for it, to react to these extra musical cues like breaths? And then, thirdly, is there scope also for then it to be applied to visual cues, like an upload from a string player and things like that?
Oh, I will answer that. Great question. So right now it's 100% based on note onset detection. So that's the only thing it's listening for.
Say that again?
Oh, note onset detection.
Note onset detection.
Oh, sorry, Mike.
From the score.
From the score. So it sees
Parts.
for both parts.
What have you two learned together?
That it does its best. So this is something called a probabilistic model. So it's going to find the best score interpretation that fits what we're actually doing, and it's going to go with that. But in terms of the data types that it's looking at, it's just pitch and rhythm, basically. Specifically the beginning of the pitch. It doesn't look at note lengths. So anything that isn't note pitch is going to be ignored. So breaths are ignored, any visual cues are ignored, and that actually answers your second question as well. So if you can't see somebody and you can't hear them breathe, how do you know when they're going to play? You don't, so you're reacting. So that's why it's a little bit late, because it is basically what we say at breath points is wait until Nikki does something and then react, because it is no way of guessing how long her breath is. But whenever it reacts, there's always a little bit of latency there because it doesn't have visual cues or the ability to process breath information.
Yeah, I will say also sort of some of the technical problems with doing Wings is there's a lot of very slow parts that are hard to do precisely the same. So part of how cadenza works is that it learns how long you're going to take with a certain note. But when you have these very slow, expansive sections, there's so much variability that it's almost not meaningful to train on that because it'll inevitably learn something that's just not right. So what we do instead is we put things called cues in there. So if it says, okay, I played this note, I don't know how long I'm going to take with it, so we'll put a cue for the next note, which is great, but the problem with cues is that they're always just a hair late coming in. So it's sort of, like Chris was saying, as part of the experiment, we still haven't quite found a way around that, but this is sort of I guess, our best approximation at this point. But yeah, very well taken points. Oh.
Becomes an additional part of your performance.
Yeah, you could definitely do it. I just have to remember to.
That would be an interesting, I think I may have talked to you about this before, but integrating some sort of external cue measurement would also be a very interesting thing. For example, maybe hitting something right before you go could be some kind of signal to the program that now is when, before it's no idea, and now it's, okay, soon after this, I'm gonna go. So that's definitely something to keep in mind for the future.
Sorry, I asked way too many questions. Dynamics, is that something that can be factored in? Because the program's reading the score, so is there a way, even if it's pre-recorded, is there a way to use the like volume capability of the recording to increase or decrease depending on what dynamic markings are in the score, along with, or even to hear the performance, and if you make a different dynamic decision, is it possible to modulate the recording even if it didn't occur that way originally in the recording?
That would be another really cool thing to look into for the future. So right now it isn't. Whatever Nikki-tron, or whatever Nikki originally played on the bass clarinet is what we're gonna get. But that would be something really cool to look into, having dynamics that change in response to live players.
This is also what I'm putting up on the screen. So this is what Cadenza is detecting. This is, if you don't know, this is a spectrogram. So it's really just pitch content. So I don't know, I guess Caitlin and Chris would be responsible for the audio level. But I guess just to see how it, in its current version, which we'll be using later, Marty, it's really just pitches that are being detected, and there's not really.
So each horizontal line is a note, basically.
So, and then each red line marks where the program picks up that note onset and where that note starts. So you see it going crazy, where there's a trill. There's detecting each individual note, and then it evens out once it, settles back in.
Why don't you play a little bit of the audio there with the plucks, which will make the picture much clearer.
Yes.
So the plucks are where the program thinks I'm playing. Me and Nikki.
Can you see where that really low line starts coming in? That's the bass clarinet. Yes.
So that's Nikki-tron with MIDI?
That is, so basically when it was recording the audio, that speaker is also blasting Nikki-tron. So that's what the microphone picked up. Oh. So what you are seeing is just what the microphone picked up, and those lines are after the fact in order to give us a little bit more information to look at if something went wrong. This is where...
That's actual recordings of YouTube.
Yeah, yeah.
Does it somehow sounded synthesized?
Yeah, it sounded like a MIDI harpsichord.
Oh yeah, there's the red lines are sort of plucks that are overlaid.
Wait, let me play it without this
Yeah,
first.
we can mute those.
So the synthesized is basically an auditory way of showing where Cadenza thinks we played our notes. But if we just play it muted, then it sounds, where's the mouse? No, here it is, okay. So that's just me there. But then I can turn this on, and I can make a little sound. So,
yeah, sorry, I was just gonna say, so having those in there, it's really useful. Here, it was actually doing a really good job of detecting. But if for some reason, as we're rehearsing, say Nikki-tron, the bass clarinet, suddenly freaks out and starts going double tempo or starts slowing down this crazy amount, then we could look back, and usually what'll happen is that there's an issue with alignment and detection. So you'll see those red lines and sort of the MIDI plucks. They will start sort of running apart and deviating from what we're actually playing. So it's really more of a sort of a rehearsal technique that we can go back and fix any issues using those MIDI plucks. Yes, Tony.
I'm thinking of a solution for, as Lloyd mentioned before, like when you take a breath during, playing. When you take a breath, especially for clarinet players, you generally do a lift, but there's physical motion, right? What if you attach something to the bell that actually, detects the motion of, like this, and then gives a little information to the machine, tells you, oh, the player is breathing.
What could possibly go wrong?
That's a really interesting machine learning problem, actually, because you have a type of data, which is bell length over time, and you're trying to parse meaning from that. So I think, from my understanding of this type of problem, it would be a little tricky, because especially when I play, I'm like, like I move around a lot. So you would have to be able to parse that intentional movement from the extraneous movement. But it would be interesting to see if we could do that, if there are specific markers of a cue movement that make it different from other types of movement.
Yeah, or even match it with audio. If there's, playing and there's movement, you could discount it. Or, if the playing stops and you hear sort of this white noise or nothing that's like a real pitch, and then you have the movement, it could be used as an indicator.
Great idea, Nikki.
Next project. We'll credit Tony on the... Yes.
Since you've been working on the musical offering, I just wondered if, or maybe you've already done this piece, I was thinking of the next piece, the one that's the canon in unison for 2 violins. So the basso continuo is playing the royal theme, and then you have the 2 parts. I mean, it only notates one part and just tells the other one. In fact, it's kind of an algorithm, right? It just tells the other part. But I wonder if you did one of those violin parts with the Nickitron, excuse me, and then the other would be the live person, and then you could have sort of decide who was going to be the leader and who was going to be the follower. But it would seem a condensed way that you could introduce, I don't know, more controls in what you're, and also a kind of, even something that because earlier on you mentioned there was the music -1 and music +1, but that would be I think would be a very interesting piece to do a kind of condensed version of this.
Yeah, I agree. We didn't do that one, but you bring up a very interesting point on who is following who.
Yeah.
So in this case, it's built so Nickitron will always follow us
Right.
in every part except one. So we've glossed over this a little bit in the explanation, but there was a part in the score where Nickitron was going a little bit crazy. So we were like, okay, you know what? We're going to make this just a static recording, music -1 style, and Nikki and I are going to follow it. So that's marked in our score, so we know, okay, Nickitron is no longer going to adjust to accommodate us.
Right.
So normally it's the binary setting, the way it's built now. So it's either completely, we have to follow it, or it's completely following us. But that's definitely something that's interesting to look into in the future, for if we can make that a little bit more fluid. So maybe Nickitron is listening to us, but not completely following us. So it has a more realistic gradient of, instead of 100% leading, 100% following, something in between where people give a little, take a little.
Yeah, so the part Caitlin's talking about is, where is it?
Previous page.
Yes,
Previous page.
here we go. So basically,
Page before.
no, it's here.
No, it's not.
Yes, it is.
Oh, you're right. Nikki's right.
So here where we have written in cadenza lead, before that, what we were doing is we were taking a little bit of time there. Actually, what was the original problem?
I think originally it
sorry, I remember.
right?
Okay, so sorry, this was a couple weeks ago. But basically, what happened is, what happens in this section is that you see that both Caitlin and I play on offbeats, so it's very difficult for us to control the tempo, and we want to listen to that leading bass voice, but the bass voice is listening to us. So it's this weird sort of cyclic circle, and it was kind of a disaster. So what we did was we just set in the score, all right, we want the recording just to not listen to us, starting from that section going down to that bottom red arrow. So then there is the problem because you need to just straight up set a tempo there. So it wouldn't if we happen to have a bit more adrenaline-filled performance, we go faster, or a bit more sluggish, we go slower. That spot will just click into whatever preset tempo that we have. So we had to be a bit careful around that. But it was sort of a workaround for this, giving the lead back to the robot. Any other questions? We're good? All right. Oh, sorry, Lloyd. Yes. No, please.
If you're setting it to follow you, like, do you ever catch yourself recording with it and then you're doing some crazy thing that you don't expect, and it not being the fault of the computer, but actually your fault?
Oh, yeah.
That you didn't realize?
This is actually, I would say, one of the biggest areas that I think would be really fascinating to work on with Cadenza, because I think, like Chris was saying earlier, it sort of assumes that the soloist knows exactly what they're doing. But, I think you can get away with that in especially these very showpiece type things where it's really solo lead and there's, people will just follow directly. But this becomes, especially in chamber music, a much more problematic because you're expecting, this third digital player to have their own agency, their own ideas, but suddenly they're swayed by a very slight ritardando that you do, and you expect them to just keep going on. So that does present a bit of a potential drawback in this current iteration. But definitely a very interesting topic potentially to look into.
Future work.
Yeah.
On the contrary, I think where I wanted to go with that was like ultimately it's the software that's then like holding you accountable. If you're making poor musical choices, which you didn't like essentially intend, if the end eventual product is that the software reacts to essentially an infinite amount of nuance in a way that's rational, and you're doing something that is misleading that you didn't sort of know, then it's like kicking your butt.
Oh yeah, it's a very.
Wait,
Sorry, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I really like the words that you are using. So you use the word misleading and irrational.
Right.
But these are computers, they don't have brains. So what we have is a very simplified model that we're putting in very clear assumptions of, okay, this is how it's going to calculate trajectory. But that model may not always line up with reality. So this very simplified model may make mistakes. This is also an issue in other areas of machine learning, where we see an image, we see a cat. Machine learning model sees an image, it sees, okay, kind of like a splotch, it sees a series of ones and zeros, and it perceives in a way that we can't necessarily comprehend. So in this type of algorithm, it's easier to understand because Chris set the parameters, so we can look back and deduct, but in other situations, you can't necessarily claim that the computer is being rational because it has no concept of rationality. I'm sorry that wasn't meant as a takedown, but Nikki, save me. No, I appreciate your commentary.
Yeah, so I will say, so I worked with Cadenza both in the accompaniment version and with this stuff. And one very interesting example is the Saint-Saëns Sonata, fourth movement. So that is something that is supposed to be sort of you're just supposed to go potentially metronomic. And when I played it with Cadenza, I realized I had massive tempo problems because I would play something and then suddenly, why is the piano slowing down? And then I check it with a metronome, and of course it's me. It's my problem. So in that way, yeah, it really does hold you accountable. I will say that there are some areas that you would wish there was a bit of a pushback. So again, in the Saint-Saëns Sonata, if you're getting to sort of the top of a run, you want to linger just a little bit on that top note, but then you come back down. Sometimes Cadenza will take that lingering a little bit too literally, and it'll slow down, so you're like, oh, but I wanted to take that time, and it's sort of pulling you back, and you need to really work very hard to make sure you click back in place. So I would say it sort of shines the light on your playing because you need to be so careful and intentional, knowing what time you're taking, knowing that, the computer is going to take everything you do just at face value, and it's not going to I guess, prod you in a way, you know, a human accompanist might. Nice. Any other questions? All right.
Did you want to answer Mr. Schifrin's question?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I think he had to leave.
Gosh, and I want to answer the question that was just asked, or at least as best I can. Yeah, cadenza makes very simple-minded assumptions about rhythmic behavior. They're not as bad as you might think. They're very simple because that's what computers deal with best, or maybe the only thing that they deal with very effectively are simple assumptions. And it is that tempo varies smoothly, that the parts should be exactly together. So, you know, maybe at the top, there are occasions in music where people want to relax the completely together part a little bit. Okay, you're going to stretch a little bit, and it's not necessary for, you know, the other instruments to do that with you. They can go on in time. So there are situations where the basic assumptions that the app makes are not really the way the person thinks about it. But it's possible to do something that is more nuanced. I mean, cadenza does everything it does by trying to copy you. You are the source of musicality. If you're musical and I can get with you, then sort of by osmosis, I become musical. This is the view it has, because it's a really hard thing to model the notion of you know, what musical stretching of rhythm would be. It's an open problem. Just because we have not done it and we don't know how to do it this day doesn't mean it's an impossible thing to do. I think there's a lot that could be done there. We just haven't done it yet. So it's a good point. It's a good point that you make. There's a lot that we haven't answered. I said at the start, it's the forte piano. So I don't know. I don't mean to offend anyone here, but you know, for me, the piano was this huge improvement, and the forte piano was a step on the way of getting there. I know that's not universally accepted, of course. It's not even politically correct. But still, you know, the analogy is fine. This first generation thing, and there are all of these open things that are left to be done.
Nice. Thank you. Yeah. Any closing comments?
All right. Yeah, thank you guys so much again for coming. We're really so happy that we had this chance to share with all of you guys all the stuff we've been working on. I feel like every time I talk about this with people, I don't know how to describe it. And it took, you know, 2 hours or however long it's been to fully show you. So I'm, yeah, so happy that you guys came and stayed so late to listen. So yeah, and hope you have a great night. Feel free to chat after.